Welcome. We're about to start our webinar. A couple minutes here, but first I'd like to take some time to introduce who I am and the program that is offering this webinar today. My name is Jennifer Bruin and I'm the project coordinator on the EDA University Center here at the Michigan State University Center for Community and Economic Development. And we are a 5-year program. It's federally funded from the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration. And we were started in 2011, in the fall 2011, for the purpose of supporting and identifying and creating and developing innovative economic development strategies that may yield high growth entrepreneurship and job creation in distressed regions of Michigan. And each year we have the same cycle of co-learning plan development, and then we also host a webinar with each one of our co-learning plan authors. Today we have Carolyn Hatch. She's a visiting scholar visiting Michigan State University from her home university of the University of Toronto. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on her and then talk a little bit about her research. She started with us in the spring working on her co-learning plan. It's entitled Skills Gap or Skills or Training Gap, the role of manufacturing firms in solving the skills problem. And I know this is a very hot topic in Michigan right now, so I'm expecting that we'll have quite a few participants. If anybody cannot hear me, by the way, please type into your question box or chat box and tell us that you're having either audio or visual issues, and we'll do our best to address that. And please also hold your questions till the end, and Carolyn will read them and answer them accordingly. Anyway, Carolyn is a PhD, and she studied planning at the University of Toronto. She completed her PhD there and has research background in regional development with an emphasis on the local global dynamics of contemporary economies and their social foundations. Mostly her doctoral work examined the learning dynamics underpinning the resurgence of Canada's high-end office furniture sector and focused on the institutional foundations of innovation and the role of design and quality in enhancing the sector's competitiveness, and also how furniture producers learn from their users. Her research for the skills gap question or controversy has an emphasis on how producer firms can play a role to address workforce development obstacles by collaborating with institutions and actors in their local supply chains and industrial clusters. Her research is drawing on case studies of Michigan's globally competitive thermoforming capital goods sector, and I'll let her explain what that is. I'm not exactly sure. I know it has something to do with, I believe, the plastics industry. And so she's going to talk about how examining the recruitment, training, and retention challenges that producers are often facing and are currently facing quite a bit, and how the increased technological intensity of manufacturing work has been had a bearing on skills requirements and the implications for the on-the-job training. So in Michigan, we're looking at this from several different angles, and is it really a question of is it education that needs to step up to the plate and provide this training, or is it really should be on the backs of the manufacturers? So without any more from me, I will bring Carolyn on. And I don't see any issues with audio, so we'll just go ahead and move forward.
Thanks very much, Jen, for your very nice introduction. And I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the generous sponsors of this research, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Economic Development Administration, and the Michigan State University Center for Regional Economic Innovation, whose support is very much gratefully acknowledged. So I'm really, really pleased to be here today to talk to you about this issue of vital public policy significance in Michigan and the U.S. today. And as Jen mentioned, that is the skills gap in the manufacturing sector. So today my focus is going to be on some of the workforce development challenges that employers currently face, as Jen alluded to in her introduction, as well as innovative insights into the way that firms and other regional stakeholders have attempted to deal with these issues in order to minimize constraints to firm and regional performance. So as Jen also mentioned, I'm currently a visiting scholar in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction at Michigan State, and I recently graduated, as she also said, with my PhD in planning from the University of Toronto. And my PhD research, I believe she also mentioned that it focused on the institutional foundations of training, workforce development, and innovation in the Canadian manufacturing industry, and in particular the high-end corporate furniture industry. So I've really been thinking about this core question of skill development for quite some time. So what I'd like to share with you today is the result of both a review of the literature, but more importantly, interviews with key informants representing government agencies in Michigan, industry associations, community colleges, as well as senior managers representing private sector high-skilled manufacturing machinery, capital machinery manufacturing firms. And in total to date, I've spoken with 15 participants and managers from a total of 3 firms in order to explore these questions. So let me move this slide. There we go. So just to provide an overview of my talk today, I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the importance of manufacturing to Michigan's economy. Then I'm going to comment on what is really quite a promising trend that's being discussed in policy and academic circles, and that is this reverse outsourcing trend and a return of manufacturing that was once outsourced to emerging economies back to the U.S. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what a viable U.S. manufacturing strategy looks like in the contemporary period and how it differs from our previous understanding of mass production from an earlier era. And the next part of my presentation is going to focus on the skills problem in the U.S. manufacturing sector and some of the causal factors that I've learned about through my interviews. Then I'm going to hone in a little bit on the situation in Michigan, and the final part of my presentation is going to discuss solutions to the skills problem, the role of industry clusters, and some of the best practices that I've observed throughout the course of this research. So why does manufacturing matter to the state's regional economy? Well, the auto industry's mass production methods invented in Michigan were the core of the 20th century industrial revolution. As well, manufacturing employs 10% of the state's workforce, over 500,000 people in the production of automobiles and their parts, metals and machinery, breakfast cereal and other foods, furniture, plastics, as well as many other highly innovative sectors producing goods for global markets. Manufacturing constitutes 30% of Michigan's economic production, more than twice that of any other sector. As well, manufacturing workers enjoy a significant wage premium over their non-manufacturing counterparts, with an average annual salary of over $75,000 per year, which is nearly $25,000 more than non-manufacturing workers. The bulk of research and development in the economy also happens in the manufacturing sector. According to the Michigan Manufacturing Association, Michigan is second in research and development spending behind California and first in industrial R&D intensity in the country, with more than 85% of the North American automotive R&D occurring in this state. Finally, manufacturing small to medium enterprises are the backbone of Michigan communities. Again, according to the Michigan Manufacturing Association, Michigan's manufacturing industry contributes more than $1.5 billion annually towards educational, cultural, human services, and other community building efforts. So I'd like to turn now to, as I mentioned in my introduction, a really important trend that's being observed in both policy and academic circles, and that is the return or the repatriation of manufacturing activity that was once outsourced to other economies back to the U.S. Several U.S. firms, including Caterpillar, GE, and Ford, and others, have announced that they're shifting some manufacturing operations back to the U.S. because of increasing production and energy costs overseas. As for the states that are creating the most manufacturing jobs, the chart shows the ranking here, with Michigan on top, and well ahead of other states for job creation between December 2009 and March 2013, with over 88,000 jobs being created in the sector in Michigan during this period. So what's starting to happen here is that multinational corporations that had formerly outsourced their supply chains and production networks to emerging economies are beginning to recalculate their production costs. And in so doing, they're starting to consider a new set of factors that influence where companies invest in new manufacturing capacity. For example, the wage gap between the U.S. and key competitors is narrowing. All over China, wages are climbing at 15 to 20% per year because of the supply and demand imbalance for skilled labor. And some of the other important factors that are shaping these locational decisions of firms include things like supply networks, financial, tax, legal, and regulatory systems, speed to markets, and intellectual property protection. And these factors that might incentivize a return to the U.S. will undoubtedly vary by both firm and industry. For example, industries that rely on intellectual property are drawn to the stronger protection and the more robust regulatory framework offered by the U.S. after, for example, experiencing the challenge of piracy elsewhere. And other firms have found that long supply chains in Asia add cost and reduce flexibility to serve customers in North America and Europe. Others seek access to the cutting-edge U.S. automation and robotic technology. So these are but a few examples of why firms are being drawn back to the U.S. But the main point here that I want to make is that this trend to this repatriation of supply chains and manufacturing activity creates a stronger demand for skilled and qualified workers in the local labor market, particularly in Michigan, as we see here in this chart. But what kind of manufacturing are we talking about here? In other words, what does a viable production model in a high-wage economy like the U.S. look like in 2013? Manufacturing in the U.S. today looks very different from the production system that was prominent during Henry Ford's automobile era, and throughout the period up to around the 1970s, that's come to be known as Fordism. In the U.S. today, we can no longer compete based on mass production economies and low cost, simply because there's always going to be other places out there where production costs are cheaper. Therefore, it's become imperative for producers in the U.S., Canada, Europe, as well as other high-wage economies to adopt high-road strategies based on high skills, high value added, high productivity, and low employee turnover. successful producers have responded to new market conditions by adopting practices and forms of work organization that enhance their innovativeness and their flexibility and their responsiveness. And this has often entailed a number of dimensions. And the first one is investments in capital and technology, as well an emphasis on product quality, in many cases design intensity, and customization rather than cost alone. And finally, the recruitment and development of a multi-skilled, technologically sophisticated and flexible workforce, as well as a strategy in which firms are able to harness the specialized knowledge of their workers to create innovative products and processes. So, given that contemporary manufacturing is dependent upon an increasingly strong skills base, one of the core questions that's been driving my research is really to try and understand some of the workforce development obstacles that producers currently face, as well as some of the factors and processes that are shaping these obstacles. So my research has shown that during the past 20 or 30 years or so, U.S. manufacturing employment has declined due to dramatic productivity improvements through automation, global competition in labor-intensive goods from low-cost producers, and rapid growth in overseas markets, among other factors. Ironically, despite an ongoing recession and employment, or rather unemployment, hovering around 7.6%, U.S. manufacturers face a significant talent shortage. The U.S. needs highly skilled workers to realize the productivity gains essential to remain globally competitive. Yet current and anticipated human capital deficiencies exist across the board. Not only are current openings for highly skilled workers increasing, workers are also retiring at a faster rate than they're being replaced. So this means that companies are going to lose a large portion of their seasoned, skilled workforce in the next 5 to 10 years. And the growing shortfalls represent a critical need for a wide range of skills. In fact, a recent study by Deloitte and the Manufacturing Institute found that 5% of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. remain unfilled simply because people with the right skills are not available. As manufacturing productivity and outsourcing soared during the last several decades, downsizing, plant closures, and layoffs ensued. And this trend was obviously very much intensified in the wake of the most recent global economic recession and the near death of major giants in the industry like GM and Chrysler. And in the best case scenarios, workers who were laid off were successfully retrained and transitioned to other parts of the economy or simply left for opportunities elsewhere. However, in the worst case scenarios, these layoffs have resulted in poverty and devastation in manufacturing communities throughout Michigan and the U.S. Not surprisingly, the industry suffers from a bad public image. Although a majority of Americans consider manufacturing important, the Deloitte study finds that less than 20% of those surveyed think that there's a future for manufacturing or would encourage their kids to enter manufacturing-related fields. Because nobody wanted to go into manufacturing, the pipeline for skilled workers has all but disappeared. And this stigma has led to a lack of student enrollment in and demand for technical programs, which has caused secondary and post-secondary schools to drop their programming. So now, in 2013, when manufacturing is resurging due to an upswing in the economy as well as this reverse outsourcing trend that's taking place, there's a severe shortage of skilled workers. And the situation in Michigan is really a microcosm of a pervasive problem throughout the U.S. So part of this story relates to a lack of lifelong training investments by firms in the U.S. economy, excuse me, compared to other high-wage manufacturing powerhouses like Germany and Japan. This has to do with the structural characteristics of U.S. capital markets and a short-term shareholder-driven investment regime that engenders short-termism and instability in employment relations. Despite the obvious links between labor force development and the performance of firms, the importance of training in the U.S. tends to be undervalued, and firms maintain a much shorter-term relations with their workers. And one of the reasons is the poaching or the free rider problem that is endemic in economies like the U.S., where trained workers may leave to work for a competitor before the firm is able to reap the full benefit of its training investment. The situation in the U.S. can be compared with countries like Germany, where market governance regimes and labor market and industrial relations institutions produce more long-term, stable relationships, and therefore a stronger propensity for firms to invest in their workers. Compared with the U.S., for example, Germany has achieved better outcomes for its manufacturing sector, including higher wages, a slower rate of job loss, and a large trade surplus. And it's done so by creating a set of institutions that adhere to the principles of high wage, high skill, high value added production. For example, German workers benefit from continuous vocational training and higher wages than their U.S. counterparts, as well as a system of wage regulation that discourages poaching. And these features have served to strengthen firm competitiveness over the long run. And referring to the slide here, the example on the bottom of the slide I think is quite instructive. And this shows the results of a tool and die employment needs survey conducted by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation in 2012, which was sent to 280 firms with a 44% response rate. And results from the survey show that while 53% of Michigan companies claim that they prefer to hire workers with certification, the average starting wage is $13.99 an hour, which is really not that much more than what a worker at Costco is getting paid. So my point is to suggest that the skills gap in Michigan and the U.S. may be exacerbated by the unwillingness of manufacturing firms to pay competitive wages and other benefits needed to recruit and retain qualified employees. So I think that this opens up some really important questions for further research that we need to be paying attention to. The 2011 Manufacturing Skills Gap Survey by Deloitte and the Manufacturing Institute that I referred to before, and that I'm also referring to throughout the presentation, is also instructive, particularly this question. So on the slide, one of the questions to manufacturing firm survey respondents is, what methods do you use to reduce the skills problem? And what I find particularly instructive here is that higher wages and benefits and increased company loyalty did not even make it on to the survey instrument as a potential strategy choice. And it's not only interesting, but is perhaps emblematic of a more pervasive problem in the U.S. manufacturing sector, which is a lack of demonstrated investment in worker loyalty, engagement, and long-termism that's essential to a high-road strategy. So far, just to recap, I've talked about the importance of manufacturing to Michigan's economic base, as well as a resurgence in manufacturing, or I should say a so-called resurgence in manufacturing back to the U.S. and especially to Michigan, and yet a vital skill deficiency in local labor markets that threatens to constrain firm and regional performance. So I'd now like to talk a little bit about the nature and the extent of the skills gap in Michigan. And this data, again, is drawn from the 2011 Skills Gap Survey and shows that out of 1,999 respondent firms in Michigan, 69% report a moderate to severe shortage of the available, 199 respondent firms, 69% report a moderate to severe shortage of available qualified workers. Moreover, 47% report a serious shortage of workers in the skilled occupational categories. And 3/4 of respondents expect that the problem of recruiting skilled employees in particular will increase over the next 3 to 5 years. And research on skilled trade job openings by state from February to May 2012 shows that Michigan tops the list with 2,029 openings. And I think that this finding complements previous findings on Michigan's lead in manufacturing job creation in recent years, which I showed on an earlier slide. Finally, research on talent demand in one specific occupational category, CNC machinists, from January to September 2012, shows that the highest demand is coming from MSAs in the Detroit area. And these findings point to the nature and extent as well as the severity of the skills gap problem in Michigan, where manufacturing constitutes a higher percentage of Michigan's economic base compared with other states. So, when thinking about solutions to the skills problem, my review of the literature and my interviews with key regional stakeholders in the state of Michigan shows that there's not simply a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather there's many different models out there from which we can learn. And what these successful models have in common is that they often involve collaborative partnerships between employers and other regional actors, whether they be government agencies or training providers, industry associations, local economic developers, or unions, community organizations, and so on. And they also entail an alignment of efforts to develop talent locally in order to meet long-term industry and community needs. And in the workforce development context, the term that's often used is cluster, in that these efforts are explicitly regional in scale and they're dependent on the geographic proximity of different institutions and actors in the regional economy and supply chain. So research shows that these types of public-private cluster partnerships have emerged throughout the U.S. in response to the skills gap problem and in a variety of forms, and often consist of local, broad-based community initiatives that focus on talent development through a wide array of innovative programs. And I'm going to talk about just a handful today. So I'd like to begin by talking about the state of Michigan's cluster strategy, which I think really exemplifies a model whereby the public sector acts as an intermediary in connecting, convening, and engaging employers, partners, and other resources at the local level through the Michigan Works agencies. And this strategy seeks to enable dialogue between employers, employment and training service providers, economic development, or rather economic developers, and other partners to result in collaborative problem solving of workforce and training related issues. For example, simply by organizing into groups, employers can become aware of resources that may be right next door to them and achieve economies of scale, for example, derived from pooled workforce training programs linked as part of a supply network. One of the most exciting discoveries of my research so far has been what's happening in the Jackson Area Manufacturers Association, or JAMA. The Jackson Area Manufacturers Association is a not-for-profit association of manufacturers and associate members located in Jackson County. And as I talked about in the beginning of today's talk, one of the most critical factors that employers are facing is a lack of talent pipeline to meet current workforce needs. And that pipeline starts at an early age. JAMA has created really innovative, in-depth youth programming for ages birth to adulthood that teaches kids applied knowledge in advanced manufacturing and exposes them to hands-on experiences. For example, I Can Make It is a week-long overnight summer camp at the lake where 4th to 6th graders have the chance to design and build products. Another example, Machining You, is a more advanced summer camp for 12 to 14-year-olds and introduces kids to CAD design, things like machining, welding, laser cutting, and programming. Engineering is Elementary is a program that fosters engineering and technological literacy in young children from kindergarten through to 2nd grade. And these are but a few examples of some of the innovative programming that the Jackson area has created to provide exposure to manufacturing and also hands-on applied experiences at an early age, which is really critical to filling that talent pipeline need later on in life. So quite similar to the employee partnership-led model of JAMA that I just talked about, the Blue Water Wood Alliance is a cluster of wood products manufacturing companies located in southwestern Ontario. And it's a model for sectoral cluster organization that aims to solve training problems and confront other innovation-related issues that are common to member firms. The BWA brings together over 80 companies in the advanced wood products industries for the purposes of joint projects in skills development, as well as technology transfer, export development, and experiences exchange. And in the arena of training, the Alliance works with community colleges, high schools, and independent education providers in the region to set up a comprehensive skills development program that seeks to upgrade plant workers and pre-train new hires. The benefit to members is the ability to place workers into higher quality training programs at a lower cost than if individual companies attempt to provide training on their own. So the next cluster approach that I'd like to talk about is quite unique in that the local community college has played a role as convener of regional stakeholders to address economic and workforce issues. MidMichigan Community College serves the regions of Aranac, Clare, Gladwin, and Midlands, which is a center of plastics and plastics machinery production in Michigan. Recognizing that the workforce necessary to sustain the local plastics industry had been eroded, the college began convening focus groups in 2007 to explore factors that could potentially inhibit growth in the industry. And to this end, the college applied for and was recently awarded funding from the National Science Foundation to work with regional partners, including area manufacturers, secondary and post-secondary educational institutions, as well as the regional school districts, local economic development actors, and community organizations. And the goal of the grant, as I show here in the slide, is threefold. Number one, to create an industry alliance. Number two, to develop a college curriculum. And number three, to recruit and retain students. And one of the unique aspects of this initiative that I wanted to kind of tease out and focus on is how it's really quite tailored to address the specific needs of a pool of potential workers, many of whom suffer from the pervasive impact of generational poverty, meaning that they often lack basic academic preparedness. So to address this vital issue, the college has also received funding from the Talent Search Program at the federal level, which provides comprehensive mentoring for students in need from the 6th to the 12th grades to help fill that preparedness gap and to successfully transition them into college programs. So the final best practice that I wanted to talk about is not really a cluster initiative at all, but rather it points to the importance of manufacturing firm-level strategies aimed at promoting worker loyalty, engagement, and long-termism in the workplace. And these findings derive from both my previous research on the Canadian furniture industry, as well as exploratory research from a small sample of firms in Michigan's capital machinery and thermoforming sector. And these incentives include strong investments in skills and training, things like obviously on-the-job training, as well in many cases classroom training, investments in off-site training, as well as online courses. And as well, it includes long-term retention of workers, especially through periods of economic downturn. In the research that I've done, these core practices are often complemented by monetary and non-monetary incentives, such as, well, the most obvious one being competitive salaries and wages, generous benefits, performance-based pay and ownership, opportunities for career advancement and growth in the company, things like opportunities for workers to share their knowledge in the innovation process, positive working conditions, cooperative management labor relations, investment in a culture of motivation, for example, programs to recognize employees, those sorts of things. My PhD research shows that furniture companies who adopted these practices place a higher emphasis on the development of a highly and multi-skilled flexible workforce and were more competitive in the marketplace as a result, based on measures of annual sales and productivity. And in the small sample of lead machinery firms that I interviewed in Michigan, companies also reported well-developed internal training programs, opportunities for job rotation and career advancement in the company, opportunities and systems in place to enable shop floor workers to share their knowledge and ideas in the innovation processes, and consequently low employee turnover. So I think I'm going to stop there and just conclude by saying that the examples that I decided to talk about today really represent a diverse cross-section of different solutions to the skills problem, one being an example whereby the public sector acts as an intermediary to bring innovation partners together. A couple of examples where employers actually partner with each other to build networks with local schools. An example where a community college plays a central role in convening different parties. And finally, effective strategies at the firm level that have been shown to be successful in addressing the skills issue. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I welcome, I should go to my last slide. Thank you so much for your time and for listening, and I'm really, I look forward to your questions and your ideas.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm going to go ahead and open up the chat box and see if we have a few questions in here or comments. Go ahead, attendees, and type away, and we'll answer them as they come in.
Regarding the distinct lack of investment in workers and a mindset of long-termism as these relate to the issues of loyalty and worker mobility, the problem, it seems, is rooted in the macro situation for manufacturers. Absolutely. They too suffer from a perception of a low probability of success. This impacts their access to capital. Perhaps a worse problem, perhaps a worse problem is the problem of long-termism. Our world, and particularly our financial world, has become much more subject to the caprices brought by increased volatility. This issue then is, how do workers fare in such a climate? Perhaps worker mobility and marketability are at issue. Question, could it be that one answer lies in more worker mobility and, for example, more freelance work? In turn, more mobility could put training investments at risk. How then do we protect a company's? Okay, so in terms of the first question, could it be that the answer lies in more worker mobility? I would argue that that is certainly the case for certain industries and sectors in the U.S. Things like new media, high technology, certain kinds of industries where innovation is very much dependent on the ability of workers to move around, to a high degree of turnover in local labor markets, and the ability in like short project-oriented type industries where growth and innovation are dependent on those short-term structures. But I would argue that in manufacturing that's absolutely not the case. We know that the kind of manufacturing innovation is really dependent on more long-term working structures and environments, and the ability for workers to be recruited into an organization and to learn through training over the long term. It's kind of a more incremental innovation process in contrast to a more radical innovation that we know in these other kinds of industries that rely on short-termism and mobility. So I don't think the answer lies in volatility at all. I think it's quite the contrary. And the question two, how then do we protect a company's investments in training? Well, that's a really good question, because you alluded to the macroeconomic conditions that are shaping these very sort of mobile practices at the firm scale, which is very much true. But all I can say is that my previous research on the Canadian furniture industry points to the importance of firm-level strategies that kind of compensate for this inherent sort of disjunction at the national scale. So the ability of firms to create strategies and practices where they emphasize and invest in their workers training and long-term development, in spite of the sort of macroeconomic institutions that sort of counteract those goals. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that's I think that industry is definitely a very good example that's showing success in the ability to train and retain workers, and consequently those firms are doing very, very well on a competitive basis. So Jen's comment was the importance of firm investment in worker loyalty plays a very fundamental role and is obviously very related to the training issue and the long-term development of these workers. And you know, if a company is going to invest in a worker's training over many years, then obviously that worker is going to have, want to stick around that firm and sort of play a more important role in that organization. So I think that's really important. I tried to bring that out in my presentation. So,
well, I don't know if they can hear me, but I had one of my.
I didn't actually ask what the starting wage was, but in terms of potential for promotion, I certainly asked that, and the companies that I spoke with are pretty successful companies that actually have all of these models of long-termism and investment in worker training. So there was definitely an opportunity for workers to kind of grow in the organization. But I think that's a really, really important question for further research, for sure, and it's one that we need to be asking. Yeah. And I did ask a question about whether or not if companies raised wages and benefits and demonstrated more company loyalty, whether that would result in better applicants and more highly skilled applicants. And the firms that I spoke with answered no to that question, which meant that they were already paying good wages and they were already attracting quality candidates and keeping them, retaining them, right? So these firms have very low level of employee turnover for the most part. So, so should I address some of the questions on the screen? So, Carolyn, is a copy of your PowerPoint available? I can certainly make that available. Yes, I'd be happy to. Oh yeah, so it can be found, so the PowerPoint can be found on the website and at the Innovation Summit on September the 4th.
Registration will be open soon.
And registration will be open soon for that. Okay, so the next question. In the firm, level strategies you mentioned, what did their wages look like compared with your earlier example of the Michigan tool and die industry? Could you comment on their average wages? Thanks. Actually, that was a question that Jen just asked, and I don't, my research on the actual firms is quite exploratory, and I didn't actually ask them about what their starting wages was, and also it's not one starting wage. We're talking about all these different occupational categories, so these are often very difficult questions for firms and senior managers to answer. So I don't know what their average wages were, but as I mentioned to Jen, I think that's a really important question for a bigger project and more research in this area. And then the next one, yes, manufacturing is more a long-term industry. However, the key is capital intensity. Absolutely. So when I talked about sort of what contemporary manufacturing looks like in 2013, it's not only about the ability of firms to invest in their workers, but it's also about this complementary investment in capital and technology. So it's not really an either or, but rather it's a both and. If firms that are doing big investments in machinery and capital, they also need smarter and more highly skilled workers to operate those machines. So it's really very closely related. And so thank you. That's a great point. The next one is, what if instead the workers had access to capital, like maker co-ops? That's a really good point. So in other words, access to capital to where they could sort of invest that in their own development. So it's about more acquiring skills in the market rather than in the firm. Yeah, that's really neat. I'm not sure. I'd like, yeah. So the next comment, think owner, operator in truck rigs. Okay. Does anyone have any ideas there? I'm not sure. But, okay. P.S. Essentially, the issue is that as long as workers feel that they are not getting a good deal, that they're going to be reluctant to give their all to the effort without the attitudinal mindset that challenges is much, the challenge is much greater. Yeah, I agree.
Well, I'm recently kind of becoming more and more curious and interested in this, and I'm having conversations with technical campuses and high schools and community colleges, and I'm asking them, are these students able to earn college credit? And will that college credit be accepted at, say, perhaps Michigan State University? And what I've been told is no. So if my 16-year-old son enrolls in a technical campus curriculum, he leaves every afternoon, goes to the campus, and begins to learn how to do laser work or programming, he is not able to take that credit and transfer it to Michigan State, and he may be an all-A student in his other required courses in math and science. There is no incentive for him to do that, other than his mother telling him that getting those practical, hands-on skills will turn into a job someday or will help you in the long run. But these are not incentives for him because he's looking at his peers and they're all taking their AP courses and having those transferred. And they're not interested because they don't see the incentive. Now, some of these students are taking college classes in kind of the gen ed area and they're transferring those, but they're not interested in the technical campuses.
Okay.
It still has a stigma, and in reality, they're still not able to get that college credit. I know some of the universities, I've heard Oakland University and maybe Lawrence Tech are accepting these, but a lot of them are not included. I think Michigan State is in that group of not taking those.
Okay. That's a really good question, and I'm not sure about the situation with the Jackson area, but certainly the Mid-Michigan Community College model that I talked about, they're creating a curriculum at the college level that is laddered into, for credit, and that's actually laddered in and transferable into an associate's degree.
But not a 4-year?
Yeah, an associate, yeah, a degree, for example, at Ferris State. So they're making sure that these are transferable to those associates programs.
Okay.
So that, yeah.
So you first have to graduate from high school, enroll in the Mid-Michigan Community College, then get your associates, then transfer to Ferris. Is that how?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that you have to necessarily go that particular route, but I do know that the college programs that they've created are transferable. Their credit and they're transferable to, if that person wants to continue.
College level, right?
Yeah, but if they want to continue on, for example, to Ferris State, then those credits are transferable. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like them to see them transferable from the high school to the 4-year program rather than having to do the community college in between, because I think that even the community college still has a stigma. When
Totally.
you have a
Yeah.
4.0 and you're at high school, your parents are not encouraging you to go to community college.
Yeah, that's a
Even
really,
if they
really
can't
great
afford
point.
4-year schools, they're still trying to encourage you to go to 4-year school.
Yeah.
So if I seem a little bit impassioned by this, it actually is happening to my son. So I am wondering when U of M, MSU, Wayne State, or if they are, somebody please tell me.
And when they're
if I'm
going
wrong. When are they going to accept these
recognize-
students, a senior from high school, and they're going to say, oh, you have these on the technical campus? Great.
Yeah.
We'll take them.
Yeah.
It'll apply towards your 4-year degree.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm still learning. But
Yeah, no, I think that what they're doing at Mid-Michigan is really, really innovative, and And I believe that that is happening there, and but it's definitely something to look into as a model for other for other universities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do we change parents' perceptions, like you were mentioning earlier? Yeah.
Well, one of the parents' perceptions is really, really key. A number of people that I spoke with said that it's the kids, but it's also the parents. It's about changing that mindset of the parents. It's about educating them that manufacturing is not that kind of dirty sort of factory job that it used to be. That there are viable career opportunities in the manufacturing of today. It's a high skilled. It's a place where you need to be technologically sophisticated in order to work in those environments and so forth. So, and that there are also very viable careers in that area. So parents they're not really aware of that. So it's really a lack of awareness. And what MidMichigan is doing, part of their grant is covering that issue. It's about changing that mindset. It's about getting those parents into the factories and on those floors and understanding that these incredibly globally competitive firms are in their backyards, and their children can be learning to work in these companies, and that they offer incredibly exciting careers. So that's very much a part of the focus for all of the efforts that I talked about.
Some of these entry-level positions are the beginning of an engineer.
Exactly.
It's building
your
engineering knowledge.
Yep.
And assuming.
Absolutely. Well, and actually what the Jackson area is doing is starting from 0 to 5. I mean, literally they're starting that skill pipeline when they're children, and they're providing these incredibly cool summer camps and that kind of thing that are exposing young kids to these manufacturing environments, and like rolling up their sleeves and actually making stuff and learning to work with machines and that kind of stuff. So it's really important to start that at a very young age. Yeah. And that's the kind of programming that has been dropped from all of the schools because of this decline in enrollment and so forth. So they're they're starting to bring these programs back, and it's working really well for those who have figured this out already. So it's pretty exciting actually to see what's happening in some of these areas.
And we need more of these models that we can share with others. Carolyn's co-learning plan will be complete, and we'll have probably a lot more content to it when she's finished, and it'll be on our website probably in the next month or so, I'm hoping. And then, of course, the summit, she'll be presenting there as well. But this is excellent work. This is much needed research, I think, very needed research. But do we have any more questions or comments?
I think we're done.
Okay, I think we are. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned. We will send out a message to the participants once we have uploaded this recording, and it will be transcribed so that you can send it on to others. It will be ADA compliant. And we do have another webinar coming up on July 11th, and interestingly enough, it is somewhat related to this. It's on makerspaces. And if you're not familiar with what makerspaces are, this is the webinar for you, because this is where we're going to learn about the different ones that are kind of cropping up all over the state. And this is an opportunity to talk to 3 presenters from East Lansing. They'll be presenting on their research on makerspaces. So that's a July 11th webinar from 2 to 3 in the afternoon. And just stay tuned for the link with the promotional flyer. The link will be embedded in that. So thank you for your participation. Thank you, Carolyn, for all of your work.
Thank you,
it's
Jen.
excellent.
And thanks for listening, everyone.
And we'll see you on July 11th.